welcome to this seminar about the Global Plastic Treaty, what's at stake and the role of science. I'm very glad that we are resuming the seminar series hereby for FRAM, the Center for Future Chemical Risk Assessment and Management Strategies here at the University of Gothenburg. My name is Daniel Slunge. I'm the director of FRAM and will moderate this seminar. And we have two prominent speakers that will guide us through this dialogue, Bethanie, Carney, Almroth, and Sylvain, Bintein. And I will introduce both of them when they start here. The first presenter is our colleague here at FRAM, Professor Bethanie Carney Almroth. She's a professor in ecotoxicology, and she's also the chair of FRAM's steering group. Her research focuses on environmental effects of plastics and plastics-associated chemicals. And she has, during the last year, played a leading role in the Scientists' Coalition for an Effective Plastic Treaty. So, welcome, Bethanie.
Thank you.
We're ready to go.
Okay, so as you heard from Daniel, I'm a professor at the University of Gothenburg. I'm also chairing the FRAM Center. It's the picture in the middle there. And then I'm one of the steering committee members and co-coordinators of the Scientists' Coalition. And what I wanted to do today was talk about the role of science in the ongoing global plastics treaty negotiations. So a little bit about the science itself, and then how we're communicating science into that space, trying to support the negotiations and ensuring that they're based on evidence and robust science. So backing up a little bit, plastics production really started growing after World War II in the 1940s and 50s. And already by the 1960s, there were some documentations around plastics pollution in media and newspapers. But there was, in the scientific literature early on in the 1970s, evidence of plastics in the ocean. So this is not a new problem. It's something that we've known about for a very long time. These first two authors, Carpenter and Smith, I just want to mention a little bit because it will bring me back to a point I'm going to make later on about conflicts of interest. But they were planktonologists working in the oceans in the North Atlantic, looking at plankton, and had identified plastic nurdles, like these little small plastic beads you see in the photograph there, in some of their samples, and wrote a paper about it. They were postdoc scientists, and they, at their workplace at the university, received a visit from some industry representatives that told them, like, hey, maybe you guys should just stick to planktonology and leave the plastic work alone. And they were like, okay, what is that? They published a second paper, and then they had industry people come to their homes and tell them to stop doing the research, to focus on planktonology. And this is documented both by the scientists themselves, who have talked openly about it recently in podcasts, but some sociologists in the US have gone back into documentation from the industries and find, like, yeah, these things did happen. So industry at that point was trying to quiet down this question. But the scientists keep working. It's what we do. And there is more evidence coming out of plastics in other places, on beaches, in fish stomachs, in seabirds. And even from Sweden in the 1970s, there were some fishermen that were bringing up these sheets of plastics in their trawls and bringing them to scientists and saying, like, hey, what is this thing I found? It looks like plastic. We took it up from the deep sea. And then at that point, people were saying it's probably not plastic because plastic floats, until they did some tests and determined, yeah, this is plastic and it is sinking in the ocean. So this is all very old news. Again, we've known about this for decades, but this is where the science started building. Science around microplastics grew even more as people developed methodologies based on planktonology using manta trawls to sample surface waters. And these were nets that had a mesh size of 333 microns. So they were sampling in the surface water and capturing anything that was larger than that. So a lot of the early plastics debris mapping in the oceans was done using this methodology. So we're looking at the surface waters and we're looking at particles larger than 333 microns. And at that point, some science was coming out doing like a mass balance of where all the plastic was. And there was a study that came out in Science saying like 99% of the plastic is unaccounted for. We don't know where it is. And some of that might very well be that these studies were based on studies looking in the surface waters, and a lot of plastics does sink. Other modeling says that probably maybe 6% of plastics is in surface waters, and a lot of it is sinking. And these pore sizes were also missing or ignoring or not capturing any particles that were smaller than the mesh size. So smaller microparticles and nanoparticles, of course, were not being accounted for in this early data. Then you have this sort of imagery that was really important in moving public awareness around plastics. And we have these kinds of pictures that you'll find in the media of entanglement and animals being injured externally, of drowning incidents. And this, it serves two purposes. A, it documents the kinds of impacts plastics could have in the oceans, but it also served a communication purpose in bringing the problem to the public. And this is also true of these kinds of photographs where you're finding animals ingesting plastics. The picture of the bird is from an island in the Pacific that was uninhabited by humans, but where animals were found to be, or birds were found to be feeding their young with plastics. And this is a twofold problem. One, they're feeding their young with plastics, which could lead to starvation, but they're also maybe feeding the birds with plastics because they're not finding their proper food supplies. So it's a problem in the ecosystem in terms of the amount of food they need to feed their young, but also the kinds of plastics that we're finding. And again, these kinds of images really pulled on the heartstrings of the public and brought awareness to these issues. So we started to see policymakers talking about plastics pollution, understanding it to be about plastic bags or plastic straws maybe early on, and to be a marine problem, which is what led us to discussions around adopting what we're negotiating right now, or what member states are negotiating right now for this new soon to be, hopefully, internationally legally binding instrument on plastic pollution. This resolution was adopted in 2022 at the UNEA 5.2 meeting. The fifth meeting was during Corona, so they had a second version of that afterwards. And then, again, this is building on resolutions that had already been adopted at UNEA, the United Nations Environmental Assembly, with a focus on marine plastic pollution and microplastics. And that's coming out of the science that we had to date and the public awareness of the problem, and sort of identifying the problem as a marine problem and as a plastic pollution problem. But what this treaty did, and with the version of it that was adopted, was frame it differently. So it moved beyond the marine environment. And it also framed plastics not only as a waste problem in the oceans, but as a problem throughout the life cycle. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what this does, but I'm also going to describe to you the Scientist Coalition very briefly. And when this resolution was adopted, a number of us who are working in the plastic space and following this process contacted the UNEP and the International Negotiating Committee, the INC, and we were very happy about the resolution that was adopted, and we wanted to know what the process would look like during the negotiations for scientific input into the conversations. And there was no real mandate for that, and there was no real plan on how that should work. So we created the Scientist Coalition to fill that void. There was a small number of us at the first negotiating meeting, like 5 or 6 or 7 of us. We started building ourselves on the ground, and built into what we have today, which is a coalition of more than 400 members from more than 60 countries. We have a lot of policies in place governing our membership requirements, our COI, conflict of interest policies, our internal governance structures, our working models on how we're producing output and how we're communicating that output. We have independent academic researchers from across fields of science, so natural scientists and social scientists, trying to understand plastics in its full complexity. And we're producing fact sheets, which are sort of plastics 101 for non-experts. We're producing policy briefs on how the plastic science can inform decision-making. We're reviewing documents for UNEP and for the INC. When we're requested to do so, we're participating in webinars. So sometimes we'll get invitations from different regional groups or different subject areas that need experts to comment on some kinds of science. We're also working in bilateral meetings, speaking with negotiators and delegates to understand their needs and trying to answer their questions. And when we don't have answers, trying to find people that can help answer them. So a sort of iterative process on the scientific needs. Webinars is there twice. I guess they're important. We're also running side events at the negotiating meetings and participating in organized side events at the negotiating meetings. Okay, so to start, again, what we're talking about to frame the problem, we have to understand what plastics is. And plastics is very complex, and the plastics life cycle is very complex. But we have defined plastics as such. They're materials made of synthetic or semi-synthetic polymers that are used for the first time to create plastic products in any form. And this necessarily includes thermoplastics, thermoset elastomers, composite resins made from bio-based and fossil-based feedstocks. And there's a few things in here I'd just like to highlight. One is that we're talking about synthetic and semi-synthetic polymers. So synthetic are completely man-made. The majority of them today, 98, 99%, are fossil fuel-based. But semi-synthetic would be something like cellulose that is chemically altered to be more stable. And that could also be used in other kinds of plastics, alternatives, and substitutes. It's something that's being created for the first time, primary plastic polymers, and that would differentiate them from secondary plastic polymers, which would be from like recycled feedstocks. And we're also making a point of including the extracted raw materials. So that might be fossil fuel-based or bio-based feedstocks. And another starting point in background, the complexity of the plastics life cycle and markets is very high. This is an image from a publication in 2018 demonstrating the global and national flows of chemicals, so petrochemicals and primary plastic polymers. And you don't need to look at the details, but just get a feeling for how complex the system is. It's also burdened by low levels of transparency. We don't know what is being produced. We don't know what's being included in products. We don't know where things are being manufactured, shipped, used, and disposed of. So there are significant knowledge gaps throughout the system. And when it comes to the plastics themselves, what's in the plastics and what they're made of is also plagued by very large knowledge gaps. So there's a study that came out earlier this year by Wagner et al. Called the Plastchem Report. And there they documented 16,000 chemicals that are used and present in plastics. When they mapped that list against known hazard properties of chemicals, they identified 4,200 that have hazard properties and 10,000 or more than 10,000 that lack data and were not able to be assessed. UNEP and the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions looked at their databases and the plastics chemicals and came back with a number that approximately 1% are currently regulated globally through those conventions. So again, high complexity, lacks of data, and these things are not being regulated. Okay, so that's where we are. And now to understand the full life cycle of plastics, like what is the life cycle of plastic? Because this resolution does call for us to address plastics throughout the life cycle. And we would identify plastics as beginning with resource extraction. So the fossil fuels or the bio-based materials that are being used to make primary polymers, which is where you have the first production of those polymers. Then you have product manufacturing. So the raw plastics, these nurdles that I talked about earlier in fish stomachs, are used to make plastics products. These are transported and traded, as are the products themselves. Then we come into the use phase, and this might be in commercial use, industrial use, or consumer use. And a lot of times the consumer use is like the only small part of this whole life cycle that most individuals in the general public will be aware of. This moves into waste management and recycling. And again, these systems are also plagued by high levels of complexity, low levels of transparency. There's a lot of data gaps. And finally, moving into plastics that already exist in the environment and the need for removal and remediation in the environment. And just to really drive home the points of the plastic life cycle, I have some photographs here. The first one with this cloud is from a train accident in the US when a train derailed carrying vinyl chloride, which is a precursor to polyvinyl chloride or PVC production. These are toxic monomers, and they were set on fire to prevent their spills and explosions. And when they're burned like this, they build dioxins, which are also toxic and cancerogenic. So this is before the plastic is even made that we have these kinds of environmental releases. The picture below that is from a beach in Sri Lanka when there was a shipping accident and a ship carrying raw plastics caught fire and sank. And as you can see in the picture, these people are ankle deep or almost knee deep in plastics nurdles. The entire beach was covered. Then the use phase comes into play, and there are thousands of products that contain plastics. Here I'm showing some that are commonly discussed: food packaging materials, fishing gear, and paint, which is one of the most common sources of microplastics in the environment. And then finally, we have waste. So this is a photograph from Dandora in Kenya, which is one of the biggest dump sites in that country, and textile waste, which is also a big problem. And textiles are approximately 60 or 70% in some markets made of synthetic materials that are plastics. Okay, and how does it look like on the planet now? Again, setting the scale of the problem. This is a study from 2020. And what these scientists did was to try to calculate and approximate the mass of animals on the planet versus the mass of plastics. And as you can see in that upper image, there's twice as many plastics as animals on the planet. And this is including insects. Like, this is all of the animals on the planet. But these numbers are from a few years ago, and I don't have new numbers on the mass of animals on the planet, but the current estimates on the mass of plastics that has been produced puts us at 11 gigatons. So quite a lot of plastics, and substantially more than living animals on the planet. And as you can see from the lower image, the built-in structure and buildings and infrastructure, the built environment outweighs trees and shrubs. And things are going in the wrong direction. There are projected increases for petrochemicals, for plastics, for pesticides, and other fossil fuel-based products. They have been increasing for the past decades, and they are projected to increase going into the future. This is from a study where we were looking at how chemicals and plastics were interfering with Earth systems functions, and we find that they are disrupting almost all of the Earth systems currently on the planet. But I'm going to summarize that environmental impact, or our knowledge about that, using this image, which instead refers to the triple planetary crisis, which the UN identified a number of years ago. And this is the three crises of biodiversity loss, climate change, and pollution. And plastics is central and connected to all of these threats. So these threats are threats to the safety of humans living on the planet. We can say that plastics affect climate change through fossil fuel use, through energy use in production, through incineration and waste management stages. There's evidence that plastics that are degrading in the environment release not only carbon dioxide, but also methane. There's also early evidence that plastics in the oceans might be modifying carbon storage, the carbon sink of the oceans, which can potentially affect climate. There are influences that microplastics might be changing nutrient cycling, nitrogen and phosphorus cycling in sediment. There's evidence that plastics are affecting albedo. When it comes to biodiversity, we can see that plastics are leading to spread of invasive species. We see new microbes emerging on plastic surfaces that differ from microbes on other surfaces, and they might have other properties or functions affecting the very base of the ecosystem. And finally, obviously, plastics are important in pollution, and we're finding them now literally in every part of the planet, in soil and air and water. And every week almost, there's new papers coming out around plastics in human bodies. So we know that there's a lot of pollution that is connected to plastics. And when it comes to humans, there are quite a number of studies, and we have decades of evidence, I would argue, showing us that plastics chemicals do impact human health. We're exposed through a lot of different pathways, through everyday products, through food packaging, through textiles, through electronics, and so on. And a lot of these chemicals can be taken up via our food, also via dermal exposure, via inhalation. And there's evidence showing adverse health effects connected to hormones, to hormone systems, to fertility, to nervous system impacts, to cardiovascular disease, to liver and lung cancers. And we also know that we're being exposed to micro and nanoplastics. This is a newer research field, so we don't have as much evidence there, and we also don't have as much evidence showing about the human health impacts of those exposures. But early evidence is showing us that A, yes, we are exposed, and B, that there's connections between this exposure and adverse health effects. But again, early days. More to come on that question. When it comes to the solution side of things, there have been a number of models that have been used to look at how we might address plastics pollution. And the old dialogue was that we needed to work with improved waste management. And this is a model showing if we have a very ambiguous, arbitrary target of 8 million tons of plastic released into the environment per year, which one could still argue is a lot, we will need to, given how much plastics are going to be produced in the future, have very ambitious goals. So this yellow part at the top where it says business as usual is following the increased production of plastics that is predicted and the existing waste management systems. And there you can see that there'll be a quite significant increase in plastics released to the environment, while the ambitious field, the blue-green field in the middle, is that if we were to implement a lot of ambitious new developments in waste management, we're still going to see an increase in plastics to the environment. So the OECD has done modeling on this. A number of different consulting firms have done modeling on this. And all of the models are showing us that we need to reduce production, that waste management will not suffice as a solution to this problem. So when we're talking about the science that can inform the plastics treaty, we can say that we need to see at the very top of the waste hierarchy production reduction. And this is going to require establishment of baselines and targets if we're going to translate the science into policy. And we don't have all of the science yet, how much plastics can the planet tolerate. We just know right now that we're beyond what we can tolerate. But science will need to inform baselines and targets there. And a large number of member states are supporting this kind of language around including ending plastics pollution, including the marine environment, and protecting human health and the environment. So starting with plastic production reduction, then we also have to have criteria to identify polymers, chemicals, and products of concern. Science can inform these conversations, and not only the criteria, but how they're applied and how we understand the data that's coming out of testing or modeling. Science can also help us understand safety and sustainability standards that might come into, for example, product designs. We're going to need to have safer and more sustainable systems when we're using plastics. We're going to need to find a way to identify where plastics are essential and where we need to use them, and where maybe we can find other ways of doing things. And that might include not just replacing plastics with other materials, but changing the systems that we're working with. So shifting to reuse, refill systems, for example. And this is, again, moving down the hierarchy. So starting with reduction, then coming into reuse, refill, and repair, and so on, all of the other R's before we get to recycling, which comes further down. Trade provisions can be useful in helping to drive motivation and to bring other countries on board into these shifts. And we will need to have improved waste management. There are places in the world that have very dysfunctional or non-existent waste management, so that definitely needs to be on the table. But again, lower down in the waste hierarchy and further down in the plastics life cycle. And finally, we need to work with environmental remediation that is done in an environmentally sound manner, so we know that the ways that we're cleaning up plastics are not more harmful than the plastics themselves. Okay, this is where we see the plastics life cycle and different provisions that can come in to the treaty to address plastics, and how science can inform each of these different steps. But again, stressing that production reduction is one of the most important targets that we would need to see. And production reduction is also very early in the plastics life cycle, where we have the least amount of complexity. So it would be the easiest place to sort of start implementing these changes. Just really quickly, I just wanted to address recycled plastics because I'm doing some research there. And we collected recycled plastics from 13 different countries in the global south. Some earlier reports had shown that these plastics contain plastic additives like flame retardants, UV stabilizers, and bisphenol A, all of which are known to have hazardous properties. So you can see that all of the samples from all of these countries contain at least 3 of the tested substances. But what we did was to take it a step further and use non-target analyses to look at the chemicals in these samples. And this is just some of them that we found. We found hundreds of different chemicals, but we found biocides, flame retardants, PHs and PCBs, personal care products, pharmaceuticals, plant protection products, and plastic production products that should not necessarily be in the recycled materials and that are not necessarily safe for use in those plastics materials. And in fact, this is a work in progress, so not published yet. One of my PhD students did leaching with some of these nurdles in water and exposed zebrafish after leaching for 24 or 48 hours. The zebrafish were exposed for 120 hours. And in mRNA analyses in those animals, we could see genes involved in adipogenesis were upregulated. So the chemicals are affecting lipid metabolism in the animals. And finally, another question that is very much on the agenda, definitely because we're coming from the field of marine science, and like what to do with all the fishing gear. And there are some ideas that we could try to recycle some of this. So we collected some fishing gear from a site in Sweden where they're using it to produce recycled plastics. And we did water exposures with a marine snail and exposed them for 3 months. And we could see behavioral changes, so the way that the animals were emerging and responding to food cues, and we could also see a decreased fecundity, that they had a decreased number of eggs that they were laying after exposure to the leachates. So in summary, what we need to see is a reduction in non-essential plastics. We need to see a reduction in unsafe and unsustainable plastics. We need to see an increase in transparency and responsibility throughout the plastics life cycle. We need to see compliance mechanisms to make sure all of this is being followed. We might be inspired by sectoral precedents, looking at, for example, fishing gear or agroplastics or textiles separately given their uses. And this can help us protect human health and the environment. But again, one of my important points, these decisions need to be based on robust, independent science and knowledge that is free from conflicts of interest. There are a lot of actors in this space that are trying to create doubt, as they will. That's another conversation we can maybe have later. But I will end there. There's a QR code to the Scientist Coalition outputs on the fact sheets and policy briefs that I mentioned. And I'm also putting there for my scientist friends a paper that we recently published on how we're communicating science in these spaces. So a bit more about not what the science is, but how we're using it and how we're communicating it. And I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Bethanie, for this very rich and interesting presentation.